Lord Willetts, we're several months on from the EU referendum result. Do you think we're any closer to knowing what Brexit means for UK universities?
It's still very early days for working out what it means. I mean, there's obviously a range of different implications for Brexit, what it means for research, whether there's any arrangement in which we could remain participants in Horizon 2020, what it's going to mean for staff mobility. And then, of course, there's all the teaching issues. Will EU students be still coming over to Britain on what terms? So I'm afraid there's a long agenda, but it's going to take years to work out the implications.
And with many politicians calling for freedom of movement to be curtailed, do you see any scenario if freedom of movement was curtailed where the UK could remain a full member of programmes like Horizon 2020?
To be honest, I think it's the Swiss negotiation which is crucial there, because of course, as we know, the Swiss voted for restrictions on freedom of movement, and the main way the EU kind of punishment for that decision was by casting doubt about their participation in Horizon 2020. That negotiation has to be resolved very soon, and I think that how that goes will be a very important indicator as to how the EU would treat the UK.
With such significant uncertainty facing UK universities, what can the government do then in the short term to provide reassurance that the sector is looking for?
Well, of course, Joe Johnson and Phil Hammond have already made a very important gesture of continuing to make it clear they'll continue to fund grants that have already been won. I hope that we'll hear more about that in the autumn statement and in the budget. It'd be great if we heard a real priority being given to the movement of academic staff. We've had the Chancellor talking about how important it is that bankers can move easily between the city and the EU. It's equally important that academics and researchers can move easily between Britain and the EU, so it'd be great to have that signalled. And we then need some very creative thinking about how we can continue to work alongside the EU, and that could involve directly joining Horizon 2020. It could involve kind of running a parallel structure alongside it, and there's some really tricky policy questions there which require very careful thought. But there are several different ways in which we could remain linked to the EU, of which direct budget contributions to Horizon 2020 are only one.
Can I ask you to look back on the referendum campaign? Universities had a campaign which focused very heavily on research and the potential risks to that. With the benefit of hindsight, do you think that was a campaign which the universities sort of played well, or with hindsight, could they have done things slightly better?
Well, I think it's been very chastening for universities, because the overwhelming view of universities was they wanted to stay in the EU, and that was signalled clearly. And to be honest, it doesn't seem to have had a blind bit of impact on the wider electorate. And that tells us that universities' place in our national life isn't as prominent or influential as it should be. So I do think there's some really painful questions for universities there. I also regret that the argument was put so narrowly in financial terms, which doesn't capture the importance of the networks that you get from being part of the EU. And also is open to the easy response, because Britain is a net contributor to the EU budget, don't worry, we'll compensate you somehow for any loss of EU funding. So I don't think that kind of way in which the argument came across wasn't particularly effective. So just like the wider Remain campaign, looking back, you can see that it really should have been communicated differently and better.
Looking forward then, with this debate, this negotiation process that's going to take place, what can universities do to position themselves to influence that debate in the most positive way?
Well, I think there are several things. It's not, now is the right time to make the case, not just for the links to the EU for financial reasons, but participating in the networks. The fact that no one country on its own can conduct world-class research any longer. But I think that the mood of the government is to accept very clearly that we are leaving the EU and then follow through the consequences, some of which are positive as well as negative. And look, although I personally was a Remainer, I still think it'd be overall in Britain's interest to remain. Given that this decision has been taken, there are some things that become more possible post-Brexit. For example, there are areas of research where there were very significant restrictions because of EU regulations, attitudes to GM and restrictions on the use of GM crops, approaches to nanotech, restrictions on the use of data that would have made a lot of social science hard to conduct. So there are opportunities there. And I think also, and I had this exchange with the Prime Minister recently, as well as links to the EU, look at strengthening links beyond the EU. What more can be done with China, with the Commonwealth, with the Gulf, with the US and Canada? And showing that universities also understand that something changed on the 23rd of June and that they are responding to that, I think is a good way of being listened to by government, recognising that something changed. And at that point, I think ministers should be more responsive. If universities say, we're doing all this to build networks and soft power outside the EU, but it would also be great if you could negotiate vigorously and have us high on the list of priorities for your negotiations with the EU.
You talk about a list of priorities there. Do you think that universities are at the moment a high priority for the government in these negotiations, or is there a risk that there's a focus very much on freedom of movement and trade, and actually universities become a bit of an afterthought?
Well, Joe Johnson is clearly very aware of this stuff. I have to say, if you listen to the Treasury and the Chancellor, the focus is very much on the city. It'd be great if we heard more from senior ministers like him about the importance of science and research. But as I say, that is now where universities have got a role, and it starts with your local MP. It starts with him or her registering that one important angle for the Brexit negotiations will be higher education, and then communicating that to key players like David Davis and Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, so that they all understand that this should be one of the top half dozen issues. It shouldn't be issue number 93.
Well, Willetts, thank you very much.
Thank you.